Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. Well, you asked for it, and here it is. Today we are talking about gender identity and religious trauma. The intersection of the two is a storied tale, but we're about to get into it. Just a reminder, we're super close to those 4,000 watch hours, and we are over the 1,000 subscribers mark. So I'd love it if you would make sure that you are sharing this information, that you are liking videos you like, subscribing to the channel, and let's keep this community going. As most of you know, if you've been here for a while, the two main topics that this channel deals with is religious trauma and all issues pertaining to the LGBTQIA+ community. Today, we have an intersection. And that intersection is our understanding of gender identity as it pertains to the way that many of us are brought up in religious institutions. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about the way the church understanding of gender has impacted society as a whole. For a little bit of clarity, when I started going into research for this topic, the things that I found were old. The information, all of the research that I was able to find that was comprehensive was dated, to say the least, which I find very interesting. Now, understand that most of us in this field are very aware that the years of really end of 2019 or anything that was started in 2019 through 2022 are kind of missing because there's a lot less ability to actually do things like surveys and get complete understandings of things because none of us had a complete understanding of what was going on in the world as a whole. So, forgiving that portion of it, I was able to find one study that said between 2011 and 2016, the number of people who were trans-identifying within the United States more than doubled. That was an unprecedented jump before, or, well, since, but also remember, I can't find a whole lot since 2016 through 2019. This stat might actually be a little stilted because I found it on a fairly conservative Christian site that was basically explaining why the church had to take a firm stand on gender identity, which may be what actually took us down this rabbit trail in the first place, because the way the church identifies gender roles and gender expectations has far-reaching consequences for individuals, especially those individuals who then leave the church at some point. I used to work in the church world. I worked in the church world in churches, local churches, for over 20 years. In that time, I can tell you that in general, everything is divided into men and women. You have men and women's Bible studies. In some churches, different sides of the church that you can sit on. Men and women can't speak together. If they're of a certain age, they can start talking. Or if they're below a certain age, like children, they can intermingle. In some churches, women are not allowed to be in charge of men unless they're younger than them. But everything sort of hinges on this idea of gender, except that it's not gender. Because if you watched last week's video, gender is a social construct. And so the churches will call it gender, but it's not gender. That's someone's sex. And in reality, the only way to actually correctly identify someone's sex is either to get a hold of their birth certificate or to check stuff out. I don't think that's appropriate. It's not appropriate. In the church world, we talk about roles. Roles for men and roles for women.
And the women are the caregivers and the ones who are supposed to nurture and care for the home and care for the family and care for the man and care for the little ones within the church world.
And the men are the ones who are supposed to be in charge and provide and be the decision makers.
I wish that was more antiquated than it actually is. Because in my tenure of working in churches, and I don't know, just being a human in general, there's so many times I see where a couple gets married, they decide to have children, the woman has the children and she stays home if she worked before. And if the dad stays home, then it's a big, huge deal because we've got a stay-at-home dad now. But it's not a big, huge deal with a stay-at-home mom unless you're, crapping on the stay-at-home mom, which, by the way, don't do. Because if someone wants to stay home with their children, let them stay home with their children. It's their life. Okay? The things that are permissible for different sexes within the church community is very bizarre to me. Have you ever heard the Billy Graham rule? In the Billy Graham rule, Billy Graham very famously made a statement that he was not going to go and have a meal or be seen anywhere or even just be alone with a woman without his wife present. There's a lot of pastors that follow this rule, by the way, and there's a lot just kind of crammed in there. Let's just pull that apart for 1 or 2 or 3 layers. That assumes that, number one, the man cannot control themselves, or it means that the woman that he is seeing is just out to, sway him to the dark side or, use her feminine wiles to get him or that the man in the situation is to be controlled by his wife being there. But if the wife wasn't there, would he not act like he was married? Would he not remember that he's married to somebody? I don't know. It's always been a very complicated thing for me to understand until I heard a quote one day. And the quote that I heard was that within the church, you are male or female first and human second. And I don't disagree with that. When you're deciding within the church how you're going to do things. In youth ministry, doing small groups, we didn't separate out kids based on what they were dealing with or even like what school they went to or the people that you would have the most in common with and be able to really dig into a small group. We separate them by sex and by age. And in doing so, we made their sex, we made their gender identity as we understood it to be the most important thing about them. So for kids who are in the moment of trying to figure out who they are and what that looks like, for them to understand that the sex that was assigned to them at birth was the most important thing about them, where was there ever space for them to explore what that looked like for them? All they would understand is gender expression and confuse that for gender identity. Hopefully you remember from my last video that gender expression is how you express yourself to the outside world. Sometimes that involves how other people see you, sometimes it doesn't, but it's about how you express yourself. And that can change daily or hourly or every time you change your clothes. Gender identity is how you experience yourself. In your brain, in your heart, inside of you, how do you experience yourself? And the thing is, any kid growing up in that type of an arena is experiencing themselves as sex first and then human. It's not long before all of the other othering that we do becomes primary to the experience of actually being human. In those moments, in those times, how did we ever expect someone to begin to understand what their gender identity meant and how that equates to their gender expression and how that matches with their sexual identity, with their sexual attraction? How did we ever expect people to become whole, which, by the way, is what we would say to people in the church. We'd say we want you to be whole and that God wants you to be whole, and that was our whole thing, right? But did we? Because what came out of those programs were kids, were young adults, they were confused and had these rules put on them for so long that they had no ability to actually pull them apart or even a chance to do so in a way that would help them to then put it back together and make sense for who they are. So they throw the whole thing away. How would it have been possible for anyone growing up in that situation to have a real chance at exploring gender identity in order to understand how that affects them and who they are as a person if they were never given the space, the time, or the verbiage to use? This narrowing everything down to someone's sex as assigned at birth doesn't stop at the church. When we take polls, when we interview people for anything, for Nelson ratings, for who you're going to vote for politically, we always separate out people by male and female. We separate them out by age, by sex, by income earnings. We separate them out in other ways, but in general, the primary way that we separate people is by their sex. And then we can't understand how people who experience themselves differently than how they were told they were at birth end up really tossing everything aside and rejecting the majority of things around them society-wise. We can't, for some reason, put that together in the fact that society has failed over and over and over again to help them to explore who they are. Our gender identities have been dictated to us for most of our lives. For that to not fit you is a foreign concept to most of our society. But I don't believe it's a foreign concept to most of our society just because it is a foreign concept. I think it's a foreign concept because so many people have had things handed to them and expected them. We do it in classrooms. We separate into boys and girls. We talk to kids in classrooms and say, boys and girls. We separate out for gym class that way. Locker rooms, like that's a nightmare. I don't understand why we're still doing this, but we are. And so all I can hope is that those watching these videos are understanding that that structure and that format was something that was handed to you and not one that you have to accept. The labels that are handed to you are not labels that you have to accept. You have the ability to learn more about yourself and to learn more about the ways that you can present yourself and the ways that you can identify. And you can not have a label at all if you want, or you can have 7 labels. Because at the end of the day, the responsibility that you have is to you, not to a church structure, not to those in leadership that have caused us trauma, not to politicians who don't actually have our best interests at heart, not to anyone else. Your obligation is to you. So who are you? And what does that mean? How do you identify your gender? And what does that look like for you? Those don't have to be scary questions. Those can be freeing questions. Those can be amazing questions if you let yourself really think through the way that that could look in your life. That's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to see you next week. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.